Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is plagiarism and a specific type of plagiarism where you have paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is when you're taking someone else's words or ideas and you're trying to represent them as your own. Now, with any kind of format, MLA, APA, Chicago style, whichever, whenever you're using someone else's words or ideas, whether you're quoting them directly or whether you are summarizing or paraphrasing them, you have to have both in-text citation and an entry in your works cited page. Because if you're representing someone else's words or ideas as your own, that's plagiarism. So what I have here is two papers from the same class. The one that's on the left, I've called the original because it was a draft that was submitted for peer response. And the one that's on the right is the plagiarized version of that original draft. So a student turned this paper, the original paper, in for peer response, did the revisions, and then turned in their final draft. The person that was on the right, they didn't turn in a peer response draft, and they were one of the peer responders to the original. And this is what the plagiarized draft was submitted. So the first thing I want to point out is the titles. So this is a paper where you're taking two fictional characters and putting them together as a married couple to see whether or not they're compatible to each other. And it was all about the students using information from the plays that the characters were in to be able to say whether these two were a good match or not. So in the original, the title is For Better or For Worse, which, if you've ever been married or seen any kind of movie or television show where people get married, you know that this is from marriage vows that are given at weddings. And what the plagiarized version does is actually do another part of the marriage vows. So, for better, for worse, for sicker, or for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. So, the original started with the marriage vows, and the plagiarized version decided, well, we'll just do things that are towards the end of marriage vows. Okay. Now, all these highlighted areas in the paper are where the corresponding text can be found. So, in the first sentence, we have has existed for millennia. In the plagiarized version, they say for as long as people can remember. Second sentence, they're saying that marriage is a union of a pair of individuals. In the second sentence here, they say it's a unification of two people. So they're changing the wording slightly, but they're maintaining the same idea as the original paper. In the original paper, they say the form of this institution has changed drastically. In the plagiarized version, it says the initial purpose, actually, that should be purpose over here, of marriage has drastically changed. So instead of saying changed drastically, they've just flipped the words and says drastically changed. In 1879, Henrik Ibsen wrote A Doll's House. In 1879, Henrik Ibsen wrote the play A Doll's House. In 1944, Tennessee Williams wrote The Glass Menagerie. In this paper, it says in 1945, so a little bit of variation there. Tennessee Williams published the play The Glass Menagerie. Okay, so each of these plays has depictions of marriage and of relationships between men and women. Both plays portray marriage and the relationship and how it is different between men and women. Okay, so you're seeing that while the student on the left is changing a couple of words here and there, they're basically saying the exact same thing. All right, so in the last quarter of the 19th century, when A Doll's House is set, women all around the world did not have a status equal to men under the law. Plagiarized version says, during the time A Doll's House was written, women did not have the same rights as men. In 1937, when The Glass Menagerie is set, the world was quite different. By the time, efforts like the women's suffrage movement had made huge strides in the pursuit of equality. When The Glass Menagerie play was set, events such as the women's suffrage movement and the ability for women to vote had taken place. These events would later lead to the equality of women and men. Original version, along with legal changes, the societal view still had far to go. Women were quickly becoming a force to be reckoned with. Plagiarized version. Things such as laws and social aspects still had a long way to go. Women were slowly moving up. So, force to be reckoned with, slowly moving up. Next sentence. The status of women in society. Let's see, wait. I think because there's a time when the plagiarized version actually mixes some things up. Now this one's the same. Okay. So, status of women in society are immensely different than they are during the time period of the two plays mentioned above. Women's social rankings have drastically changed since the two plays have been published. Okay. Now, at this point, the plagiarized version does take a different structure because the thesis of the first paper, the original paper, is if these two characters were married in the present time, they might be shocked by the way relationships have changed, but they also might welcome the differences. So that's having the thesis statement at the end of the introduction. Okay. Now, the plagiarized version actually doesn't have the thesis statement in the introduction. They say it in the second paragraph, and you can see these two things. So, if the two characters were married in the present time, they might be shocked by the way relationships have changed, but they also might welcome the differences. If these two characters were married in today's time, they would be surprised at how relationships have changed, but would appreciate how they have changed. Okay? A Doll's House. Nora Helmer appears to be the model wife of the time period. She is a homemaker. In the play A Doll's House, Nora Helmer is seen to be the perfect wife, so instead of model, perfect during this time period, she is a housewife and manages the household. She is a homemaker. She wants nothing more than to be financially supported by her husband. She wants nothing more than to be supported by her husband. Okay? So they may have moved a couple of things around in the plagiarized version, but if you go through, and I have gone through both papers, there is just similarity after similarity after similarity. So you can see where it's pretty easy to see that even though this particular paper that's on the right-hand side didn't trip up a plagiarism checking software because they're using different words, they're still maintaining the same ideas as the original. And you can't do that. Um, the whole goal behind any paper, whenever a professor is giving an assignment to you, is to see how well do you know the material. And if you're just copying what other people say about the material, that doesn't really show that you understand the material very well. Um, Obviously, this doesn't happen very often in my classes. When you submit your drafts for peer response, it's about trying to give feedback and receive feedback. It's actually been a really long time since I've had one student plagiarize another student in the same class. So, this would be an anomaly. But this can at least show you or demonstrate to you how not only do sometimes people do this, but most of the time when we see this, when professors are grading papers in classes, the students that are plagiarizing from closely rewording stuff that's on the internet. So websites, articles, newspaper articles. That tends to be the thing that we see the most when people are plagiarizing is they'll take someone else's words and ideas and reword them slightly like what you've seen here and submit them that way. And again, there's no citations for these paraphrases that we're seeing. Even then, obviously you can't cite another person's paper in the same class and say that these are your ideas because obviously they're not. But I hope this clarifies the fact that when you are using another source, and usually, again, that source will be an academic source and not another student's paper, but whenever you're using sources, whether you are summarizing that source, paraphrasing that source, or directly quoting that source, you need to have in-text citation, and you need to have an entry in your works cited page. And of course, if you're using the exact same wording as the original source, you need to enclose that borrowed language inside quotation marks. If you have any questions about this, please let me know.